And sisters, today we finish one of the most beloved surahs in the Quran to many of us, and that's Surah Yusuf. The story of Yusuf alayhi salam, it resonates in the hearts of many of us because, it explains the difficulties and trials of life. But when you look at the comparison of Yusuf alayhi salam and his difficulties, one of the things that we see is that Yusuf alayhi salam always remained sincere and honest and true to himself. And one of the unique things about Yusuf alayhi salam's story is that, he wasn't exposed to his father, who was the Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, for a very long time. Some of the scholars say he was separated from his father because of what his brothers did around the ages of maybe 7, 8, 9. And what's unique is that although he was with his father for just a short while, he gained so much with his father. And so much so that many years later, if you recall in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, when he's in the prison and he's giving dawah to the prisoners, what does he say? He says, I am on the faith of my father and his forefather, right? Yaqub alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam, and he's tracing his lineage back to Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now, what's very unique is that how can a young boy who's been disconnected from his father for so many years at such a young age still remember the message and the lessons his father taught him? And so much so that before he gets thrown into the prison, or the reason because he's thrown into the prison is because of the encounter with the minister's wife, right? If you all know, he gets thrown into slavery because his brothers tried to kill him. And long story short, he gets sold into the house of the minister, one of the most powerful figures in Egypt at the time. And many years later, once he becomes an adult, the minister's wife tries to make a move on him. And we all know the verses, and it starts in Surah Yusuf around the verses of 20 onward. But just to jump to verse 24, because we don't have too much time, it's very interesting how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains the test that he made Yusuf alayhi salam go through. And one of the things we all know is that Yusuf alayhi salam was granted with he was extremely handsome. That was one of the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that in that moment when the minister's wife tries to seduce him, it's translated in verse 24, and she certainly determined to seduce him, and he would have inclined to her had he not seen the proof of his Lord. And thus it was that we should avert him from evil and immorality. Indeed, he was one of our chosen servants. There's two things I want to talk about in this specific verse that goes back to the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. The first thing is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that she liked him. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says Yusuf alayhi salam had an inclination towards her as well. So and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you what's in the heart of Yusuf alayhi salam. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says something amazing. He says, but we showed him a proof from his Lord, right? And thus we averted him. Now many of the scholars, they debate what was this sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Yusuf alayhi salam. What was this sign? And Ibn Kathir and many other scholars, one of the signs that they say is that in that moment, when he saw the minister's wife in front of him, when the desire of lust came, he remembered his father. He remembered his father in his moments of weakness. And he remembered his father, and that averted him from attempting any type of action towards the minister's wife. Now, what's amazing about this is that, again, it goes back to Yusuf alayhi salam only having a short time with his father. And what we really need to learn from this story is that, brothers and sisters, as young as our children might seem, and as innocent and as gullible as they might be, the ages to teach them what discipline is at these very ages. When they're just learning to speak, when they're just learning to understand, they're going to school, etc. One of the most important tasks that we have as parents in America is that you live in a society that's far or just as difficult as Egypt was back then. You want to talk about Yusuf alayhi salam and his trial against the minister's wife? Our children see these trials every single day. You go to high school here, right? You go to high school here, half the girls are coming in topless, shirts just like a bra on, even, right? Short pants, etc., whatever it may be. Every day they're tempted with these type of difficulties, and we have put them in the minister's house. So it is also our job to bring them to the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is our job to bring them to Taraweeh here. There should be no excuse that my son is too young, my daughter is too young, etc. They need this more than ever. It might seem difficult to the naked eye that why should I bring my young child? They might get exhausted. They have school the next day. They have whatever. It's because you have put them in a very difficult test. And in order to counteract that difficult test that we have put our kids in by bringing them to this country, we must also bring them to the only place where they'll learn discipline. And if you fast forward through the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, even towards the end, after he hasn't seen his parents in years, what does he do? He sees his parents for the first time. He gets up off of his throne. He lets his parents sit on the throne. You see that? He hasn't seen his father many years. But still, once he even reached the top of society, he was still humble to his parents. And the main lesson that we learn here is that if you teach your children Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will teach your children how to be good to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will teach your children how to behave in society. But it is upon us to teach them who Allah is. It is upon us to bring them to the house of Allah. And it is upon us to help guide them to the right path. And if we can do just a little bit, and you can see just a potential children have, like Yusuf alayhi salam, for example, then you will see our society will start to change. And the difficulties and the struggles that many parents go through in our society today, one of the most difficult things I have to hear sometimes is when a parent reaches out to me and they're like, you know what, my son or daughter, they've been dating this, non-Muslim for many years. They're even living together. They have a business together, whatever it may be. What do I do? I'm like, listen, this is like 20 years into their relationship and you're asking me now? You just figured it out? You never brought them here? You never tried to, speak to them? And that's the second reminder. One, bring them to the masjid. Encourage them to come for Taraweeh. When I was younger, my father, he said, you have two objectives in Ramadan. You fast every day and you pray 20 rakat Taraweeh every day. Anything else, it's up to you. Do whatever you want. But you're going to do these two things. Right? And what he was teaching me, and I didn't understand it at that time, was discipline. He was teaching me that regardless of what I think is beneficial to me, I still have to go. That's number one. Number two is that in order to even be able to have those conversations, we need to have that relationship. And one of the things that we learned about Yaqub alayhi salam is that he had a real relationship with his son. Because his son came to him first in the beginning of the surah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces it by saying, and Yusuf went to his father, and he told him about the dream, that he saw 11 stars, the sun and the moon making sajda to him. And you know what's interesting about that dream? Yusuf alayhi salam in that verse says, Ra'aytuhum twice. Ra'aytuhum li sajidin. He says it again. He's saying because he's nervous. And he repeats himself. Because he has figured out the dream. That his father was making sajda to him in the dream, right? That's the sun and the stars, the moons, etc. They're all making sajda to him. And Yaqub alayhi salam himself knows that his son interpreted the dream because he said, Ra'aytuhum twice. He saw the nervousness in his son's voice. And what does he tell his son? He gives his son advice. He says, be careful, don't tell this dream to anybody, especially your brothers, right? But then he gives him words of encouragement. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you a gift, right? And then he compares him to Ismail and Ibrahim alayhi salam. And so, I know time is running short and I don't want to take too long as we can continue to Taraweeh. But the story of Yusuf alayhi salam has tremendous oceans amount of lessons. But for us, one of the things that we can take away, as I see in this crowd today, there's many adults, but there's few teenagers. And there's few kids who are even a little bit younger than teenagers. And this is not common. Growing up, this was not common. Growing up, we had teenagers filled with the masjid as well, coming with their fathers, coming with their mothers, etc. So it's upon us to also do that, to teach our kids Islam, to teach them what it means to be disciplined in salah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us, guide our children. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instill the love of Islam in all of our hearts. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rescue our children from the desires and the temptations of this world. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instill the love of the Quran and listening to the Quran in our hearts. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wassalamun ala al-mursaleen. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.